Welcome back to the deep dive. We live in a world absolutely bursting with information. Articles, studies, reports. It's just this constant, often overwhelming stream.
It really is. How do you even keep up?
Exactly. How do you cut through all that noise and get to the core insights, those real nuggets of knowledge, without drowning in data? That's our mission here, to give you a shortcut to being truly well-informed, complete with those surprising aha moments that, make everything click. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating corner of the research world that tackles exactly this challenge, especially when we're trying to understand human experience.
The qualitative side of
And
things.
think about it. So much of what truly matters comes from understanding people's perspectives, their lived experiences, their motivations. But how do you combine multiple qualitative studies, all these different stories and insights to get a bigger, more cohesive picture? This is where something called qualitative evidence synthesis, or QES, comes in.
A really important field.
And our guide for this deep dive is a groundbreaking structured methodology review from the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology by Andrew Booth and his colleagues. What they set out to do was tackle a fundamental challenge in QES. How do you choose the right way to synthesize all that rich qualitative evidence? Because apparently there are quite a few ways.
There are, and picking the right one is key.
What's particularly cool about their work, I think, is that it offers a remarkably clear and memorable tool for navigating this complex decision. They call it the retreat framework.
Retreat. Easy to remember.
Yeah. And by the end of this deep dive, you'll not only understand what retreat stands for, but also how it completely transforms the process of making sense of qualitative data, ensuring your insights are as robust and, relevant as possible.
It's a great point you raise. For a long time, researchers trying to bring together findings from multiple qualitative studies, say, exploring patient experiences with a new treatment, they faced a significant dilemma. There just wasn't a clear, universally accepted map for choosing the most appropriate method for their specific research question or purpose.
So it felt a bit like guesswork.
A bit, yeah. Or maybe just relying on what you knew, even if it wasn't the perfect fit. It often felt like throwing darts in the dark, hoping you hit the right approach.
So it's not just about doing a synthesis, like ticking a box, but about ensuring you're doing the right one, the one that truly fits what you're trying to achieve. What happens if you get that wrong?
Precisely. If there's a mismatch, you could end up with findings that don't actually answer your core question. Or, even worse, you might misinterpret the original research. Our source paper highlights that this work actually grew out of a larger EU-funded project, Integrate HTA, which focused on patient-centered assessments of health technologies. They found that choosing the wrong QES method was a real bottleneck. It led to wasted effort and, frankly, unclear results sometimes.
Okay, right. That makes sense. So let's unpack how they even began to build a framework to tackle such a complex problem. Was it built completely from scratch, or did they adapt something?
Not entirely from scratch, no. They started with what they call a best fit framework synthesis approach. Basically, they analyzed 26 key methodological papers published between 2001 and 2014.
Okay.
Interestingly, though, they initially had a simpler kind of experience-based framework, almost like a teaching heuristic, called TREAD.
TREAD. What did that stand for?
Time, resources, expertise, audience, and data. Just those.
That's a fascinating insight. So TREAD was their starting point, almost like a rough draft.
You could say that.
And then what happened when they began mapping existing methodological texts against this initial framework? Did it hold up?
Well, that's where it got really interesting. They quickly realized TREAD wasn't quite complete. It was useful, but it missed a couple of things. Their extensive analysis revealed two crucial additional domains that needed to be included to provide a truly comprehensive guide.
Ah, okay. So TREAD evolved.
Exactly. This expansion led them directly from TREAD to the retreat framework, making it a much more robust and a diagnostic tool for researchers.
So the retreat framework isn't just the catchy acronym, though it is catchy. It's truly built from extensive analysis and solves a critical problem for researchers.
Definitely.
Let's walk through each of these 7 criteria then, because together they offer, a complete roadmap for making informed decisions about qualitative evidence synthesis. First up, R is for review question. This seems foundational. The question itself determines everything, doesn't it?
Absolutely, it really does.
Yeah.
In QES, your question can be quite fixed, almost like an anchor, with predefined parameters. It's similar to how a clinical trial might use a PIQ question, very specific.
Right. Population intervention comparison outcome. Very defined.
Exactly. Or it can be emergent, more like a compass, offering a general direction but allowing the specific path and limits to reveal themselves as you explore the data. Much more like, say, grounded theory in primary research. The
Hmm.
key is understanding right at the start. Are you looking for a specific narrow answer or a broader, perhaps evolving understanding?
Okay, so fixed anchor or emergent compass.
Precisely. And, for example, interpretive QES methods like meta-ethnography, which aims to synthesize findings into new theories or understandings, they typically address those emergent compass-type questions. Whereas aggregative approaches, such as meta-aggregation, which focuses more on systematically summarizing and pooling findings to create actionable statements, often start with more fixed, anchor-like questions.
Got it.
So, as a researcher, you'd ask yourself, to what extent is our review question already fixed, or is it likely to be emergent? And maybe, is this review meant to stand alone, or does it need to connect with, say, an effectiveness review?
Next is E for epistemology. Now, this sounds like the deep philosophical stuff. How does that impact practical research choices and, why should we care about it in a deep dive like this?
It sounds academic, I know, but it's profoundly crucial. Epistemology is essentially your philosophical GPS for navigating knowledge. It's about your assumptions on the very nature of truth and how you believe you can know it. A reviewer has to be acutely aware of this to avoid, well, violating the philosophical foundations of the original qualitative studies they're including.
Okay, violating them. How so?
Think of it as a spectrum. On one end, you might have idealist approaches. They're often more iterative, exploring multiple perspectives, sometimes even challenging the assumptions within the literature itself. On the other end, you have realist approaches, which tend to be more linear, seeking clearer, perhaps more objective findings. If you disregard the philosophical stance of the original study, say, you take a very realist approach to synthesizing studies that were deeply constructivist. You risk profoundly misinterpreting their findings.
Ah, okay. You're essentially twisting their original worldview to fit your own synthesis method.
Exactly. You have to respect the source material's underpinnings. So you'd ask, to what extent do we want to acknowledge the different underlying philosophies of the studies we include? And how will that influence our final interpretation? And also, where does our own review team sit on that idealist-realist continuum?
That makes sense. Then there's T's for time frame. This feels very real-world: budgets, deadlines, project timelines. But the paper says it should never singly determine the choice. What does that mean for someone trying to, get this work done?
It means time is a crucial moderator, a practical constraint, absolutely. But it shouldn't be the only factor driving your choice of method. Time intensity and the overall duration are obviously affected by how complex your chosen methodology is, the number of studies you're looking at, and frankly, the sheer conceptual richness or contextual thickness of the data in those studies, how much deep thinking is required.
Right, so more complex methods take longer.
Generally, yes. Some methods, like meta-aggregation or perhaps the best fit framework synthesis, they're designed to facilitate more rapid approaches. Maybe because they avoid deep reinterpretation or they use existing external frameworks to structure the synthesis. Conversely, highly interpretive methods like meta-ethnography, they're often very time-consuming precisely because their ambition is to generate new theory or deep understanding. That takes time.
So you need to weigh ambition against the clock.
Exactly. You'd consider, do we need to generate completely new knowledge from the ground up, or can we leverage existing frameworks or knowledge resources to perhaps accelerate the process? And critically, are we prioritizing breadth of scope, covering many studies lightly, or depth of interpretation, going deep on fewer studies?
Another practical consideration are for resources. Beyond just time, what other practical factors are we talking about here?
This covers the people aspect, their collective skills, and the sheer effort involved, and of course, the funding. This includes everything from, mundane things like interlibrary loan fees to travel costs for team meetings, and crucially, the availability of specialized technologies or software.
Ah, software, like for coding.
Yes, certain methods are greatly facilitated by specialist software. The Joanna Briggs Institute has software for meta-aggregation, for instance, or tools like NVivo or Atlas T are often used for the detailed line-by-line coding you might do in thematic synthesis.
Right, these aren't always free.
Definitely not. So you need to ask, is this primarily a literature-based project, just us and the papers? Or will we need to budget for wider involvement, maybe stakeholder consultations or collaborations? And will our preferred methods rely heavily on specific proprietary software? Or can we manage with perhaps generic in-house solutions or even manual methods? It's about being realistic about what you actually have to work with.
Okay, got it. Next E is for expertise. Who's on the team and what unique skills do they need to bring to the table for this kind of complex work? It's not just about reading papers, is it?
Absolutely not. Every QES requires some generic synthesis expertise, understanding systematic review principles, but some methods demand highly specific skills. For instance, the source paper notes that metaethnography places substantial demands upon the synthesizer and requires a really high degree of qualitative research skill. It's almost an art form, requiring deep interpretive capacity.
Okay, so that's quite specialized.
It is. In contrast, something like meta-aggregation is described as more author-oriented and text-oriented. This means it's less reliant on the reviewer's personal interpretation and more focused on extracting and collating the original author's findings. And methods derived from primary qualitative approaches, like thematic synthesis, which mirrors thematic analysis in primary research, well, that can often be sustained by the primary qualitative expertise already present in many research teams.
That makes sense. So you draw on existing skills.
Right, so the critical questions become, do we already have the necessary skills within our core team? Or will we need to bring in external expertise, maybe methodologists or subject experts? And what kind of expert input will our preferred QES method require? Is it needed up front, throughout, periodically? Is it intensive?
A is for audience and purpose. This makes total sense to me. Who are you talking to, and critically, what do you want them to do with the information? I imagine that changes everything.
It's absolutely paramount, and maybe even the most important factor after the research question itself. Is your audience policymakers who need clear, concise recommendations? Is it frontline practitioners looking for practical tips? Is it patients wanting to understand experiences? Or is that the general public?
Or other academics.
Or other academics, exactly. Are you aiming for local impact within one hospital, say, or global utilization? And maybe most importantly, is your goal to influence practice with directive, actionable statements, literally telling people what to do based on the synthesis? Or is it more about enhancing understanding, providing conceptual enlightenment, helping your audience think differently about a phenomenon, even if there isn't a single do this message?
So the output looks really different depending on the goal.
Completely. Outputs from methods like thematic synthesis are often more directly relevant to policymakers because they can distill findings into clear themes and recommendations. Whereas the more complex, often conceptual outputs from metaethnography or grounded theory synthesis might be more suited for academic discussion or sparking further research. So you really need to consider, what do we know about our primary audience's preferences? What kind of findings do they value? Do they want practical recommendations or deeper conceptual understanding, textual summaries or graphical displays? And crucially, how do they actually plan to use our synthesis product?
Finally, T is for types of data. This is about the raw material itself. How does what's available from existing studies, the stuff you actually find, shape your entire approach?
Right, this criterion looks at the nature of the data within the studies you identify. Primarily, it considers the richness, which means the depth of conceptual detail available for doing theoretical development.
Okay, how much theoretical meat is on the bone?
Exactly. And thickness, which is about the amount of specific situational context provided in the studies. How well can you understand the setting and circumstances? It also considers the sheer quantity and the overall methodological quality of the included studies.
So what if the data isn't very rich or thick?
Well, if the data you find is generally thin, perhaps it comes from very brief case reports or maybe limited qualitative sections embedded within larger quantitative studies, then your method choices might be limited. You'd likely lean towards more descriptive approaches like meta-aggregation, thematic synthesis, or maybe narrative synthesis. These methods are better suited to summarizing findings when deep interpretation isn't really possible.
And if the data is rich?
If the data is rich and dense, you might choose to tackle fewer studies but go much deeper, perhaps using an interpretive method like metaethnography. Now, there are no hard and fast rules on the number of studies. The source notes metaethnography examples often involve fewer than 6 studies because the interpretive process is so intense. Though they mention one impressive case that managed 77 studies through some significant methodological innovation.
Wow. Okay.
But generally, descriptive approaches, like meta-aggregation, can often accommodate larger numbers of studies because the analysis isn't quite as deep for each one. So you'd ask, how conceptually rich and contextually thick are the studies we expect to find? And roughly how many studies will we likely be analyzing, and what's their general quality?
So what does this all mean for someone actually doing this work, or even for us as informed consumers of research trying to understand these syntheses? The paper gives us two excellent real-world examples that really bring the retreat framework to life. Makes it less abstract.
They're really helpful. Let's imagine an academic team exploring the profoundly complex reality of patients expressing a wish to hasten death, a very sensitive topic. Their aim is to deeply understand the meaning and motivation behind this phenomenon, and they're specifically seeking out conceptually rich, qualitative research. They've managed to identify 8 such studies that seem suitable.
Okay, so let's walk through retreat for them. Starting with the review question for this team, it sounds clearly explanatory and interpretive, right? They're not just describing, they're trying to understand the why and the meaning.
Exactly. It's an emergent, compass-like question. They want to explore the nuances. And that feeds directly into their epistemology. They consciously embraced an objective idealist stance within a constructivist frame, which basically means they're prepared to dive deep into the varied meanings and constructions of reality presented in that complex data. They acknowledge multiple perspectives.
Okay, and what about the practicalities, like T's for time and R for resources?
Well, they allotted a thorough year for the project, which indicates they weren't rushing for a quick answer. They planned for depth. And importantly, they had good external funding, allowing for a large, dedicated team. This robust time and resource allocation allowed them to realistically pursue a more complex, time-consuming method.
And their E, expertise.
Crucially, they had a team deeply skilled in specialist qualitative research methods, essential for highly interpretive work like this.
Makes sense. And finally, for A, their audience and purpose, and T, the type of data.
Their primary audience was academic, other researchers. They were seeking conceptual enlightenment, aiming to advance understanding within the field rather than providing immediate directive action points for clinicians, say. And the type of data they anticipated finding, and did find in those 8 studies, was rich and conceptual, precisely what you need for deep interpretation.
So putting all those retreat factors together.
Given all these factors, their choice of method was clear: meta-ethnography. The justification was sound. It's an interpretive QES perfectly suited for generating and extending theory. It was informed by rich, thick data, and it allowed them to push beyond simpler synthesis methods that wouldn't have done justice to the data or the question.
Okay, that illustrates the interpretive path really well.
Now, let's look at a different scenario. Consider a team of academic nurses who want to develop practical guidance for young patients experiencing everyday pain, like chronic headaches or back pain. They want to identify and synthesize evidence specifically on adolescents and young adults' experiences of living with this kind of pain. But they anticipate that the studies they find might be relatively thin in detail, perhaps from many small practice-based case studies or brief interviews, but quite plentiful in number.
Right, so a different starting point. For this team, their R review question would be more descriptive. What are the experiences of? They're not necessarily aiming to build a brand new theory, but rather to summarize the range of existing experiences to inform practice.
Precisely. It's a more fixed, anchor-like question focused on description and aggregation. And their epistemology was pragmatism. They were aiming for practical utility, for lines of action, as the paper puts it: what works, what helps.
And the practical side, time, resources.
Their time frame was a standard 1-year systematic review period, fairly typical. And for our resources, they had external funding supporting at least 2 reviewers. Again, pretty standard for this kind of work.
Okay. And what about the expertise on their team and who they were trying to reach with this information?
For expertise, they had generic qualitative expertise within their nursing team. They understood qualitative principles, but weren't necessarily specialists in complex interpretive methods like meta-ethnography, which actually fits their more pragmatic aim quite well. And crucial for their A audience and purpose was their broad target audience. Other academics, yes, but also health professionals on the ground, maybe even managers making service decisions. They explicitly sought to inform current practice, so they needed clear, actionable findings.
And the data itself, the final D.
And finally, their type of data was that expectation, which turned out to be correct, of relatively thin information, often coming from practice-based case studies rather than deep theoretical explorations.
So, given all those factors, their choice became clear, just in a different direction.
Yes, exactly. In this case, their choice of method was meta-aggregation. The justification was that it's a descriptive QES method aiming directly to inform practice recommendations by systematically summarizing findings. And critically, the available data was anticipated to be thin, and likely wouldn't sustain a more demanding interpretive approach like meta-ethnography.
So they needed to aggregate those practical findings, not necessarily generate deep new theoretical insights.
That's right. It fit the question, the purpose, the audience, and the likely data.
As you can hear, choosing the right qualitative evidence synthesis method is, well, it's a complex, multifactorial decision. It's definitely not a simple algorithm with one clear path.
No, it really isn't. It's more like a strategic chess game, as you said, where each move, each consideration depends on all the others. You have to see the whole board.
So how do you navigate that complexity? Does the paper give any hints about which factors might be, more important than others?
It does suggest something interesting. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the source material suggests that perhaps in the absence of more definitive empirical evidence comparing methods, the two most privileged considerations, the ones you should probably think about first and foremost, are the review question, what are you asking, and the audience and purpose, who is it for and why.
Okay, so start with the what and the why who.
Kind of, yeah. These big conceptual considerations then get moderated or shaped by the more practical concerns like resources, time, and expertise. And of course, the underlying epistemology and the actual type of data you find also play crucial roles in ensuring you align the chosen method properly.
That makes sense. Conceptual drivers moderated by practical realities.
Exactly. And this raises an important question. What if the picture is unclear after considering all this? Or maybe you're just unsure which method to pick, perhaps you're new to QES.
Yeah, what's the fallback?
The paper offers what they call a risk-averse strategy. They suggest that often thematic synthesis might be the most accessible and frequently preferred initial method if you're uncertain.
Thematic synthesis, why that one?
Well, it's relatively straightforward. It aligns well with common qualitative analysis techniques many researchers already know, and it can handle various types of data. But what's particularly clever, they note, is that thematic synthesis also strongly resembles the first stage of meta-ethnography, the coding and theme development part.
Oh, interesting. So it gives you options.
Precisely. It gives you an option to potentially deepen your analysis later, moving towards a more interpretive synthesis like meta-ethnography if the source data turns out to be richer or thicker than you initially anticipated. It's a great potential stepping stone.
That's a really useful, practical tip. So what does this all mean for you, the listener, trying to make sense of research or even undertaking it? It's a powerful reminder, I think, that every piece of knowledge you encounter is shaped not just by what was found, but significantly by how the inquiry was designed. Who was it for? What were their assumptions? What kind of data were they working with?
Understanding these underlying choices, the retreat factors essentially, helps you evaluate and apply new information with far greater insight. It allows you to ask critical questions about how conclusions were reached, not just accepting them at face value.
So the next time you encounter a piece of research, especially a synthesis of qualitative studies, consider not just what it found, but take a moment to think about how the very structure of the question, the philosophy of the researchers, the intended audience and impact, and the nature of the data itself all shaped its journey from raw information to compelling insight.
It adds a whole new layer of critical appraisal.
It really does. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the retreat framework. Until next time, keep digging for those nuggets of knowledge.